as hotspots arise around the world. Our military is powering down.
Those of you in the Army know that the Army is reducing its size.
I worry about the capability and the capacity to win in a major fight.
With the armed forces getting new marching orders.
Male ROTC cadets were pressured by the military to walk around in women's high heels.
I found that entire incident just kind of bizarre.
Is the new U.S. military ready to face new threats?
You're sending the message to the rest of the world. You're basically retreating.
Fox News reporting rising threats, shrinking military. Here's Bret All.
The Iwo Jima Memorial reminds us of many things. First, of course, of the uncommon valor of our troops. But it also reminds us that it can be a dangerous world out there, and our military never knows when it will be called upon to travel overseas and accomplish a mission. And it can remind us as well that as much as we may desire peace, there's no replacement for a military that is strong and ready.
Let us pray. Eternal Father, strong to save, as we bid fair winds and following seas to the Fighting 56.
September 2015, we're witnessing a military funeral, not of a person, but a Navy frigate. The USS Simpson is being decommissioned.
There's a feeling of sadness to say goodbye to a ship that has been as important to our profession as all the rest that have gone before her.
The Simpson was the last U.S. warship to engage in ship-to-ship combat in 1988 during Operation Praying Mantis.
3 Iranian naval vessels and at least 2 small boats were sunk or very severely damaged. They must know that we will protect our ships, and if they threaten us, they'll pay a price.
Not that long ago, the Navy had many of this class of frigate. Now they're all decommissioned. It's not just the Navy that's saying goodbye to old friends. In March 2014, the Army bid farewell to the Kiowa Warrior helicopter, a workhorse of their air cavalry in Iraq and Afghanistan.
All the pilots will be gone, all the aircraft will be gone. It's only going to be in the history books that people are even know the role it played.
In the Air Force, the president has capped the number of F-22 stealth fighters, far short of the number originally envisioned.
Our budget is a zero-sum game, and if more money goes to F-22s, it is our troops and our citizens who lose.
These actions reflect a trend. Numerous military programs have been scrapped, including the Combat Search and Rescue helicopter, the Army's Future Combat Vehicle program, the Navy's Next Generation Cruiser, and several missile defense systems, such as the Third Sight Missile Defense Plan for Poland and the Czech Republic. Along with this downsizing is a major reduction in the troops themselves. For instance, the Army's active force is expected to drop to the smallest since before World War II, 450,000 soldiers.
We've cut the military to its lowest levels. Yet we are facing a world that is the most complex environment we have faced since at least the end of World War II.
Retired 3-star General Michael Flynn ran the Defense Intelligence Agency during the Obama administration.
Frankly, the United States of America is in a less strong position today because of the readiness and the size of our armed forces.
I spoke to Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense in the last years of the Bush administration and the early years of the Obama administration. He told me President Obama promised him there wouldn't be any significant changes in the military budget for a while.
Overall, did he keep to his word?
Well, I think that began to fray. Fray may be too gentle a word.
Before too long, Gates found himself cutting hundreds of billions from the defense budget. And that was only the start. Gates was informed the president wanted to announce even more cuts.
Over the last 2 years, Secretary Bob Gates has courageously taken on wasteful spending, saving $400 billion in current and future spending. I believe we can do that again.
What was your reaction?
Well, I guess I'd have to say I felt double-crossed. After all those years in Washington, I was naive.
To many, the cuts weren't about economic efficiency so much as a strategic change in the role of the military. You told President Obama's staffers that the defense cuts sent a big strategic message abroad. The United States is going home, cut a deal with Iran and China while you can.
I think overall it has had that impact. You're sending the message to the rest of the world that you're basically retreating.
Later you meet with President Obama and you tell him the way you will compensate for forced cuts in the next war is with blood. More American kids will die because of our decisions. What was his response to that?
I think he acknowledged it. What I was pitching at a minimum was the world doesn't seem to be getting better. Before you head down a path of deep cuts in defense, why don't you take it kind of slow? You know, it was one of those things where I lost the argument.
I think that he sees the military actually as something that is more dangerous to the world. And I think that he looks at us, I actually do. I think that he looks at the United States military and sees it as a threatening application around the world than actually as a useful tool.
How much more dangerous do you think the world is now than it was 7-8 years ago?
I think more dangerous, far more dangerous.
The Obama administration has been tightening the belt of the military. Is this being done to match a slimmed down version of American foreign policy? We'll look at that when we return. Our diminished military didn't come about simply due to cost-cutting measures. Some see it as part and parcel of this administration's particular view of America's place in the world.
The next First Family of the United States of America.
On the night he was elected, Barack Obama promised a different sort of foreign policy.
The new dawn of American leadership is at hand.
It didn't take long to see this new leadership in action. On March 6, 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton pressed a reset button with Russia, promising a new era of better relations. And on June 4, 2009, President Obama gave a speech in Cairo, promising a new beginning with the Muslim world.
Tension has been fed by colonialism that denied rights and opportunities to many Muslims.
He had a confidence coming in as president in 2009 that he could alter fundamentally our relationship with the Muslim world.
Joe Lieberman was chairman of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security from 2007 to 2013.
Unfortunately, I think the message he sent was that the United States was no longer going to exercise its leadership of the world, which, incidentally, through Democratic and Republican presidential administrations from the end of the war right up until this time, had been the great guarantor of security and prosperity and freedom in the world.
Jeffrey Goldberg, national correspondent for The Atlantic, who interviewed Barack Obama on his foreign policy, tried to explain the president's approach.
He refers to the Washington playbook. The Washington playbook is something happens in country X, and therefore we have to send 50 cruise missiles to deal with that problem. And what he wants to do, he says, is break Washington of the habit that every problem overseas comes with a potential military solution.
So it was clear he had a new take, but the question remained, what would President Obama actually do? He was against the war in Iraq, but his military people warned against a hasty withdrawal.
It was really important that we try to maintain a military presence there in order to make sure that the gains that had been achieved with a lot of blood by the United States as well as Iraqis, that those gains could be maintained.
Leon Panetta was President Obama's Secretary of Defense from 2011 until 2013.
That's why the Pentagon supported maintaining a presence there.
The key to preserving an American military presence in Iraq was to negotiate a stay-behind force. The president would have to take the lead.
The only chance we would have had for an agreement would have been his intensive involvement personally, and that didn't happen.
And so, on December 18, 2011, the last convoy of U.S. troops pulled out of Iraq. While all that was happening, the Arab Spring was spreading throughout the Arab world. demonstrations and riots and even civil wars from people challenging their leaders. On January 25, 2011, Egyptians gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square to protest the policies of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, America's longtime ally.
I've always considered Egypt to be critical to our ability to provide stability in the Middle East.
When it became apparent Mubarak had to go, the military urged caution, but the president pushed for his immediate removal.
Literally, the entire national security team recommended unanimously handling Mubarak differently than we did. And the president took the advice of 3 junior backbenchers in terms of how to treat Mubarak. One of them saying, "Mr. President, you got to be on the right side of history." And I would be sitting there at the table and I'd say, yeah, if we could just figure that out, we'd be a long way ahead.
I think he venerates the military, but I don't think he believes that generals should be trying to influence policymaking.
On February 11th, Mubarak resigned.
The wheel of history turned at a blinding pace.
The happiest day in the White House, as it relates to the Middle East, was probably the day that Mubarak left.
In June 2012, Egypt elected a new president, Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. In February 2011, Egypt's next-door neighbor, Libya, also went up in flames. The country's dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, had been cooperating with the U.S. since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Many voices around the world were now demanding he be removed from power. Once again, the president's top military advisors counseled caution. When he sided with those who urged him to support the overthrow of Gaddafi, his Secretary of Defense resorted to extraordinary measures.
Did you actually tell your subordinates to limit the amount of information they gave to the White House on military options available in Libya?
All I said was, I don't want any military plans or options going to the White House that I haven't seen.
I mean, you write it a little bit more bluntly. You say, don't give the White House staff too much information on the military options. They don't understand it.
Pretty much.
It's a little more blunt. You had concern about that.
Absolutely.
About running military operations out of the White House.
Yeah. Yeah. The experience that we had had with that in Vietnam didn't work so well.
On March 19, 2011, President Obama, citing humanitarian concerns, ordered the American military to lead a coalition to confront Gaddafi. On October 20, 2011, the Libyan leader was captured and killed by a mob, eliciting this response from the Secretary of State.
We came, we saw, he died.
Then there's Syria. On August 20th, 2012, after the Syrian regime, led by Bashar al-Assad, threatened to use chemical weapons against its enemies in the country's civil war, President Obama put him on notice.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized.
The president ordered the military to prepare to strike if Assad did indeed cross that red line. On August 21st, 2013, the Assad regime used those chemical weapons to kill hundreds of men, women, and children. How would America respond? President Obama ordered his military to stand down.
They used chemical weapons against their own people, and we did nothing. We demonstrated weakness instead of strength.
We'll have more on the results of President Obama's foreign policy later. But when we return, we look at how he's transforming our military from the ground up. So far, we've seen how the Obama administration, at least according to its critics, views the military in a different way. And those critics maintain this new attitude has already cost us. One thing we know the Obama administration has changed about the U.S. military: the words they use to describe certain activities.
What did you make of the fact that under this administration, the Pentagon was required to refer to military actions against Islamic terrorism as overseas contingency operations? Yeah. And that the actual acts of Islamic terrorism were to be referred to as man-caused disasters.
It completely exemplifies the approach of this administration that we're not even going to call our enemies what they are. which are Islamic terrorists.
Critics say such language is just part of the political correctness this administration requires of the military. Some think it's harmless. Others wonder.
At Fort Hood in Texas, on a clear day in 2009, Major Nadal Hassan, a doctor in the U.S. military, stood up on a table, shouted Allahu Akbar, and then began to fire. He killed 13 and wounded many others. It was a shocking event.
Staff Sergeant Alonzo Lunsford was one of the 32 American soldiers Hassan wounded that day.
As the laser went across my eyesight, I blinked. He discharged a weapon. The first round went in right here with my left eye, and it spun me around, and I hit the floor. He came up on me, he shot me again.
As Sergeant Lunsford lay still in a pool of his own blood, he watched Major Hassan train his weapon on 21-year-old Army Private Francesca Velez.
When he was getting ready to shoot her, she said, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant. He fired anyway, and her last words was, oh, my baby, my baby, my baby.
Private Velez and her baby died that day. A horrific event, and some believe a preventable one.
Hassan, the Fort Hood terrorist killer, was communicating with Anwar al-Awlaki, the radical Islamist cleric who was then in Yemen.
In one of the 18 emails he exchanged with al-Awlaki, Hassan told him, I can't wait to join you in the afterlife. Lieberman, who led the Senate investigation into the Fort Hood massacre, suspects the blame may reside in the environment prevailing in Obama's military.
Political correctness can't lead you to close your eyes to a clear and present danger to the U.S. and to your colleagues in the U.S. Army.
That air of political correctness only thickened as the Obama administration insisted that what happened at Fort Hood was not an act of Islamic terrorism, but rather an example of, quote, workplace violence.
How could you say that a terrorist murdering 13 Americans was workplace violence? That's just ridiculous.
As for Sergeant Lunsford, he's still hurt by the government's lack of frankness.
What hurts more than the womb itself is a sense of betrayal, because a sense of betrayal is when you wake up, it's there. When you sleep, it's there. It's something that never leaves me. It never leaves me.
The divide between the Obama administration and many in the military only widened over the handling of the case of Army Private Bo Bergdahl. Bergdahl, a man the Obama administration labeled a POW, was released by the Taliban in exchange for 5 of their top leaders. The ceremony announcing his release was supposed to be a celebration.
This morning, I called Bob and Janny Bergdahl and told them that after nearly 5 years in captivity, their son Bo is coming home.
What was your reaction when President Obama hosted Bergdahl's parents at the Rose Garden ceremony?
Oh, I was pissed. Absolutely. In my view, Bergdahl should have never been labeled as a POW.
Did the men you served with consider him a soldier who had been captured or a man who had deserted his platoon?
We knew immediately that day the circumstances of his disappearance. He essentially had just deserted his post. We were mad as hell about it, but we didn't diminish any of our efforts to try to get him.
Waltz was ordered to lead Special Forces teams to search for Bergdahl.
It was the #1 priority in the entire theater of Afghanistan. And the Taliban immediately knew it. And they began feeding false information into our informant networks to try to bait us into ambushes. One of my Special Forces teams went into an Afghan compound where we thought Bergdahl might be, and the entire thing was rigged with explosives. By the grace of God, it didn't explode, but those were the types of situations that we continually found ourselves in night after night after night for months.
President Obama responded to the controversy by dispatching one of his top aides to praise Bergdahl.
He served the United States with honor and distinction.
When President Obama sends out National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and she says that, in fact, Bo Bergdahl served the United States with honor and distinction.
I about threw my television out into the yard. Both me, his fellow platoon mates, my men, my fellow Green Berets that had nearly died looking for him were outraged. It also shows how tone deaf this White House can be to how military members think and feel. They take words like that, served with honor and distinction, very seriously.
Frankly, the White House probably should have made no statement whatsoever.
Leon Panetta told us he was dismayed by how the White House handled the Bergdahl case.
I don't mind, obviously, the effort and negotiations, but you don't just walk in and say, oh yeah, we'll give you 5 bad guys. These were individuals who killed, in many cases, our own soldiers. What assurance do we have that they're not going to wind up blowing up innocent Americans?
Demoralizing.
Yeah, incredibly demoralizing. And demoralizing to our men and women in uniform as well. When you're out there in harm's way and your commander-in-chief releases the Taliban's top 5 draft picks, it sends a pretty bad message to our troops and to our Afghan allies that we need to be serving alongside and encouraging.
How has this new vision of the U.S. military been playing out across the world? That's next. Earlier, we saw the diplomatic overtures the Obama administration made when it took office. Today, we can see how those policies played out. The president had promised a diplomatic reset with Russia, even scrapping a missile defense system in Europe as a conciliatory gesture. And after his re-election, he pulled America's main battle tanks out of Germany, tanks that had been there since World War II. All eyes were on Vladimir Putin to see how he'd respond. And in February 2014, Putin sent in troops to seize Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula.
In Europe, we envisioned a different kind of relationship than what has actually emerged. We didn't anticipate that Russia would illegally annex Crimea. We didn't see that kind of destabilizing activity.
Next, Putin's forces began menacing Ukraine itself.
The fundamental point in dealing with a bully like Putin is that you cannot allow bullies to get away with what they want to do.
But the president rejected calls for a muscular response, instead announcing limited sanctions.
I believe there's still a path to resolve this situation diplomatically in a way that addresses the interests of both Russia and Ukraine.
I think the president should have taken some very strong steps to make very clear to Putin that this was unacceptable. He should have provided arms to the Ukrainians.
But he didn't. And today, Russia is emboldened, threatening to spread its sphere of influence even wider. Secretaries Panetta and Gates and others told us that you can let bullies get away with bullying or you pay a price.
I was talking about Ukraine with the president, and he told me very bluntly that Ukraine, as a non-NATO country living in the shadow of Russia, will always be subject to Russian meddling and domination. And so what he's doing there is basically signaling that this is not worth the United States investment.
Then there were Barack Obama's overtures to the Muslim world, where he hoped to change the image of America. He had pulled American troops out of Iraq without a stay-behind force that had been recommended by his military advisors. But without a U.S. presence, violence immediately returned across the country. Neil Ferguson, a professor of history at Harvard University, remembers talking to veterans of the war.
They had turned it around. To be told the mission was being aborted must have been a shattering blow.
The Iraqis, of course, couldn't leave. Some found another cause.
Many of them wound up eventually working with ISIS to create the force that ultimately came back and invaded that part of Iraq that they held and hold today.
In Egypt, President Obama had supported the overthrow of America-leaning Hosni Mubarak, and his administration applauded when a new president was elected, the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed Morsi.
I have come to Alexandria to reaffirm the strong support of the United States for the Egyptian people and for your democratic future.
Well, this was hilariously wrong in the Egyptian case because The Muslim Brotherhood turned out to be the most extreme group capable of winning large numbers of votes.
Once in office, Morsi granted himself unlimited powers and imposed a constitution based on Sharia law. Egypt, the administration seemed to welcome the ouster of Mubarak and Morsi.
Egypt was a classic case of, hope and change not actually coming to fruition.
Egypt descended into chaos. Morsi, in turn, was overthrown in a coup. Libya had been the one nation where President Obama was willing to take action, with an intervention supported by the UN. Soon, dictator Muammar Gaddafi was gone, which only led to the question, what happens next? What happened next was Libya fell into chaos, a fact brought home tragically by an attack in Benghazi, which killed 4 Americans, including Ambassador Chris Stevens. Soon, warring factions, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, were fighting for power.
It was a complete mistake to go into Libya. I was in a key job in the administration, and I can't sit here and tell you what were our goals for that operation. I really don't know. To eliminate Gaddafi, that was a severely dumb decision.
He said very bluntly to me about the Libya intervention, quote, "It didn't work."
Wasn't he warned by people like Secretary Gates about Libya's tribal history and the dangers of taking out Gaddafi?
There was a huge fight in the administration. Turns out that the Gates side was right, but I think Obama now is on the side of, you know what, I should not have let myself be pressured into this intervention. And that profoundly influenced the way he dealt with Syria the next couple of years.
Syria, you'll recall, is where President Obama drew a red line. And then it was crossed. The president and his advisors agreed on an attack plan, but he pulled back at the last moment.
I use the term stunned because I was stunned by that.
Chuck Hagel served as President Obama's Secretary of Defense from 2013 to 2015.
It reversed a very comprehensive, complete decision that had just been made a few hours prior to that. And the president had made the final decision, and a few hours later, we're pulling that down, we're reversing that.
Secretary Hagel told us the president's decision damaged America's credibility.
It was all over the world, and our allies would ask me, how can we have confidence in whatever else he says?
It's an old principle that the president should be very careful about drawing lines. But once he drew that line, then the United States is obligated to enforce that red line.
For a lot of people in Washington and a bunch of other places around the world, this was a weak moment for the United States, a weak moment in his presidency. What he told me was not only was it not a weak moment, it was a, quote, proud moment for him, because it's the moment that he broke with the Washington playbook.
So he doesn't see it as weakness at all?
He sees it as a moment of great prudence. He sees it as the application of smarts. He does not see it as weakness. He sees it as strength.
But if it was a proud moment, others ask, what has it produced?
In the end, what do you have? You have a Middle East that will be devastated, more suffering, more killing, more distrust, more hatred.
And so the man who presented himself as the man of peace has actually presided over much more violence in the Muslim world than happened under his predecessor.
When we return, we talk to men in uniform and ask them if we're prepared. America is lucky that it's been separated from its greatest enemies by 2 oceans. But the world is getting smaller, which makes some ask if it's a good idea that our military is getting smaller. In the summer of 2014, Vladimir Putin tested his Air Force against NATO defenses.
They sent a large contingent of aircraft that we hadn't necessarily seen before as far as the numbers in that formation.
It was one of several such incidents, and the response was very much like the drill you're seeing now at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska.
Seconds count because of the vast distances here in Alaska.
Colonel Dave Pifferario pilots this F-22 Stealth Raptor. fully armed and ready to go on a moment's notice.
It takes a lot of time to get out there, so every second that we can make up on the ground, we can get closer and identifying whatever is out there.
One thing that Piferario has seen out there, Russian Tu-95 Bear bombers, capable of carrying nuclear weapons.
Wave to the guys, and they'll wave back to you and acknowledge that you are there.
These encounters have become common enough lately that at NORAD, the Eyes of the North, they've gone back to an old custom, placing red plaques on the wall every time there's an intercept. There are plenty of experts who see Russia as a danger we can't simply ignore.
Russia presents the greatest threat to our national security.
Russia is the only country on earth that has the capability to destroy the United States of America.
We're confronting a Russia that has now entered a new chapter in the Cold War.
And it's not only Russia we have to watch out for. Last September, China sent 5 warships toward Alaskan waters.
We began to posture ourselves for any event that might happen while they were here, especially with understanding the president would be visiting at that time.
Colonel Harley Bodine commands the NORAD Air Operations Center.
So we moved forces around to ensure that we were able to track them with the utmost confidence to know exactly where they were the entire time.
While the Chinese were offshore, President Obama visited Anchorage and gave a speech.
It proves that this once distant threat is now very much in the present.
He wasn't referring to a military threat.
Human activity is disrupting the climate.
He was talking about climate change. Meanwhile, as Russia builds brand new bases across the Arctic and China builds up its land and sea forces, the Pentagon is reviewing a decision to cut back up to 71% of an airborne paratrooper brigade based in Alaska.
Every senior governmental official that's been up here knows that this is a vital component of the Army.
Deputy Commander Jeffrey Crapo is part of the 425 Infantry Brigade combat team that's ready to go anywhere in the Pacific within hours' notice.
Our senior leaders are having to make tough decisions in the environment we're in right now.
But such decisions are all part of our newer, smaller military in its newer, less intrusive role. To Neil Ferguson, there's a lesson in all this that we're already starting to learn the hard way.
The lesson is that it's when a great power withdraws that conflict is most likely to escalate. That's exactly what's happened, and the result is a sobering one.
Indeed, amid the rising threats, the Army has returned its battle tanks to Europe and pushed off the decision to cut the 425 by another year, until another president takes office. What kind of world will that president, he or she, inherit?
The next president will face a world that is more complex, more challenging for American interests than any president of the 8 that I served.
This is about whether or not we can promote a world that ultimately can share in the values that the United States is all about. If the United States doesn't provide that leadership, nobody else will. Nobody else will.
I think it's very fair to say that President Obama is a retrenchment president. He doesn't want America to overcommit its military. The emphasis is on quick, nighttime, light footprint raids. If you're Obama, you argue, hey, the military's in a lot better shape than when I got it because I don't have 180,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan fighting wars that are A, unwinnable, and B, not that important.
I have grave concerns in terms of the readiness of our force, the Army forces, to be able to deal with great power war with one of or two of 4 countries. You're talking about China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
We're going to see ourselves potentially in a war that's far greater than what we have experienced in the Middle East, given everything that the President of the United States has been told about the complexity and the danger that exists in the world today. Stop the bleeding that you are causing to our armed forces.
The U.S. has been involved in non-stop military action abroad for more than a decade and a half, and Americans are widely thought to be war-weary. But we all know it is still a very dangerous world. Our first president, George Washington, famously warned his young country against foreign entanglements. But he did say something else, just as significant. One of the most effective means of attaining peace, he said, is to be prepared for war. That's our show. Thanks for watching.